All right, welcome everybody to the webinar from SME on building a data literate culture. I believe we are all set to go, so let's go ahead and start here. So here's the nuts and bolts of this webinar. First, I'm going to give you my promise on what you're going to get out of this webinar. Got a few quotes to get you thinking, talk a little bit about me and talk about SME, and then we'll jump right in. So let's get started. All right, so my promise by the end of this presentation, you will have a working definition of data literacy. After all, that's why you're here. You're going to understand the main characteristics of a data literacy culture, and you're going to know the next steps to start implementing that data literacy culture. So here's a quote to get you started. For individuals to be able to comprehend the data, they must be able to read it before they can use it. And I like that quote a lot. It actually comes from Jordan Morrow, who not only works for Click, but is leading the dataliteracyproject.org. There'll be a lot more information about that to come, but definitely leading the way as far as data literacy and driving more culture adoption along the way. Here's another quote. Without language, one cannot talk to people and understand them. One cannot share their hopes and aspirations, grasp their history, appreciate their poetry, or savor their songs. Now, this quote is actually from Nelson Mandela. But the reason I bring out this quote is because, as you can see there with me highlighting the word and putting it in blue, language, perhaps we can take this quote and maybe manipulate it a little bit to talk about data or the language of data. So let's try. Here's my take on it. Without understanding the language of data, one cannot talk to coworkers and understand their role. One cannot share their findings and new hypotheses, grasp their history of successes and failures, appreciate their contributions, or savor their greatest accomplishments. So what we're saying here is data is the new language, or it's going to be a lot of workers' second language. And if you don't understand it, how could you possibly talk to your coworkers, bosses, different companies that you might work with, vendors, so on and so forth? How can you have conversations about what's working, what's not, if you don't understand how to talk about data? And that's really what we're going to get to in this particular webinar. Okay, before we get there, let's talk a little bit about me. My name's Brian Misseri, and at the heart of it, I'm a data storyteller. Really, what I enjoy more than anything else is looking at raw data, looking at it and analyzing it, and then figuring out how to tell a story, how to take that data and make it meaningful to the right people. So if I'm at my current company and I need to talk to our CEO, Chris, then, how do I take what I have found at the company, what's working, whatever I have to be talking about, and bring it into a story that I can then bring to Chris to make that data more meaningful. That's really what is at the heart of what I do. And with data literacy, it's what I hope to do for a lot of companies going forward. Now, I've been also beyond working for SME, I was a local Tampa business owner for the past 8 years. So I do have that experience of being the owner of the business as well as working for a business and helping from a consultant side of things. So I think that really helps me because a lot of times I'm able to say, oh, that reminds me of when I did this, right? And again, part of being a data storyteller. I started working for SME in 2018, so not too long ago. And really, my goal is to bring my experiences to SME and then sort of to build this data literacy program so that we can get it out to as many, customers as we possibly can to try to help them build that data literate culture. I am a former firefighter, and the reason I mention that is because you're going to hear me tell a couple firefighter stories along the way. Again, as a storyteller, I go back to what I know. And as a firefighter, I have a lot of stories and different business applications that I think of today that actually make me think of things I learned in firefighting. Kind of odd how that happens. At the time, I would have, if I was on a fire scene, I would have never said, oh, this is going to be applicable in 15 years when I'm talking about business. But lo and behold, it is. I've also been married for 13 years, and I have a beautiful wife as well as a beautiful 8-year-old daughter who is keeping me on my toes. And there you go. I just switched out my picture there because I thought it was fun since we were sort of drawing on a virtual a whiteboard that there is a little sketch of, sort of what I would look like on a whiteboard. All right, let's move on. SME, that's who I work for. So who are we? Well, really, we're a data analytics integration firm. That's a fancy title. What does it mean? Well, just what it says there. We help integrate data into our clients' businesses. So we do a lot of things. We were founded in 2011 by our CEO, Chris Moyer. And really, our services include everything from BI integration, data governance, data literacy, obviously, what I'm talking to you about, as well as just project management. So we don't just go in and help with specific tools, although that is a lot of what we do, like BI tools, like Click or ThoughtSpot or other ones. We also come in with services, and really, at the end of the day, our goal is to come in, right, and help companies become more data literate. And we do that through a variety of means because maybe they need more help with the data governance side of things. Maybe they just need help with the tools and getting those tools up and running so they can actually visualize the data. We do a lot of stuff in those areas. So, like I said, at the end of the day, what we really are data analytics integration firm. Okay, now that you know a little bit about what we're going to talk about today in this webinar, you know a little bit about me, and you know a little bit more about SME, let's dive right in. So, why data literacy? Well, let's talk about the background, talk about the analytical world as it states right now, and why this matters now. Let's start with background. So, why is this important? Well, let's start with a couple key questions to ask yourself. Do you trust your data? And I'll add to that, if you don't, why don't you? Are you asking the right questions of your data? Super important. We're going to talk about this a little bit more later. Do executives at your organization make decisions based on gut feel? Now, we are going to talk about gut feel a little bit more too, because I want to say this now. I'm not saying gut feel is bad, but gut feel alone is bad. So we'll definitely come back to that, but it's an important question. Do you have a culture where employees are comfortable challenging data with their executives? Ooh, that's a big one, right? Because we've all worked for companies or currently work for companies where that's not the culture currently. You could never have, subordinate maybe challenge the data in a boardroom, maybe not even be in the boardroom, right? But they can't challenge it with maybe the executives. That's a toxic culture and one where a data literate culture is really never going to thrive because if you can't challenge the data up through the chain, how are you supposed to make actionable, decisions along the way? So the global data sphere 2025, what is this? Well, this is the total amount of data being used in the world, right? So by 2025, they're saying there's going to be 175 zettabytes. Now, what is a zettabyte, right? Before we go any farther. Well, one zettabyte is equal to 1 million terabytes. So you're probably more familiar with terabytes because we have 1 terabyte drives and stuff. So basically, we're saying 175 million terabytes by 2025. That's 4,785 data driven interactions per person right now. And that's up from like 300 per day only like in 2017. So it's exploding. We know this, right? You can even see the Internet of Things smart thermostat there on the wall to the left. Just one example of how this is working. It's not just in one industry. It's here or there. It's in all industries all across the world. So 61%, what is that? Well, that's the annual growth rate of that data, which is amazing. 49%, they're saying will be stored in the cloud. 30% of that data will be consumed in real time. And this is probably the most amazing one, 9%. Doesn't sound like a high percentage, but that's actually how much they have adjusted this 175 zettabytes just since 2 years ago when they reported it last. So think about that. It's 175. They're guessing 175 zettabytes by 2025, and that's 9% higher than what they guessed 2 years ago. So you can kind of see where this is going. Okay, so let's move over to the analytical world. Well, a lot of people don't really realize that there is 4 different parts to the analytical world. There's not four levels, I should say. You have descriptive, then diagnostic, you have predictive, and then finally prescriptive. Not to get those confused. So descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, and then prescriptive. So let's break those down a little bit more because I think it's really important to understand what this means. Let's start off with descriptive. So what's happening in my business? That's sort of the question you would start with. And honestly, this is where most, not only our clients, but clients overall, companies overall get stuck. So I like this picture because each one of these sort of blue rectangles that you see on here is maybe a database or a table or even an Excel file, and all those words that we can't read underneath them are all going to be, columns and dimensions and oh, I don't know, how many are there in that picture? 100, right? So going from this to something like this, and you say, oh, well, that's easier to read. I can actually look at that. This is actually telling me what's happening in my business. But now I have a question. Why? That's the diagnostic side of it. Not all companies are even here yet, or I'd say a lot of companies aren't here yet. Why is this happening? Well, one way to look at it, in this particular case, we're looking at a graph inside a BI tool called ThoughtSpot, and I'm able to drill down. And a lot of tools have this. ThoughtSpot does a really good job of it, being able to drill down and say, like, well, I see what's going on, but why is that happening? And so now in this particular case, I'm able to drill down and see the different alarm descriptions that are happening because I have accumulated misses on alarms. This would be like um, in the energy sector, right, where you're looking at alarms or maybe meters, miss meter reads, those kind of things. Okay, now we get above that. This is where a lot of people would like to be. Predictive analytics. What's likely to happen? So now we're not only just looking, that's basically the same chart we were just looking at, but now we're actually forecasting data. And you can see some stuff at the bottom there, like 80% confidence interval for that forecasted data. This is actually sort of an out-of-box addition that's in ThoughtSpot, which is great. You can actually apply algorithms to start forecasting, getting into that predictive. This is also where a lot of people start thinking about machine learning, big data, AI, where the big dollars go, right? But as we will see, and we'll talk about more here, most companies are not ready for this because it's a building block. They don't have the descriptive and diagnostic in place yet, so they have no business being in predictive. Now, there's one more level about predictive, prescriptive. Now, prescriptive is what do I need to do? So let's just back up. What's likely to happen is predictive. See, even I get it messed up. Predictive. Prescriptive is what do I need to do? Oh, okay, so this is what every company would like to have, right? So much data and it's so well placed and everything else before it is in line and we're forecasting future and now we're doing that on a variety of data sources. And now I want the computer program or the data for lack of better terms tell me what to do. Well, I told you I was a firefighter, so here comes one of my first fire examples. Let's talk about this like my fire plan of attack on a structure, okay, or a building if you don't want to say structure. I'll try not to use, those fancy, fancy firefighter words like structure, right? Okay, so what do I need to do? So let's start off with some easy things. All right, I arrive on a fire scene, and I'm maybe the fire chief. I'm the first one in command when I get there, and I want to look at current wind conditions. Okay, well, in past years, that literally was my fire chief looking and watching the wind. But as things have progressed, we know that it's probably not a far reach to say that we could get live wind conditions, right? On a dashboard right in front of the chief as he pulls up for that part, that let's say that apartment complex that we're at. Also going to need to know not about available resources. Okay, what kind of trucks do I have coming? What can they do? Which ones are out of service, in service, so on and so forth. Maybe I also want to know my nearest exposure temperatures. Well, that would be pretty cool if you could set up a couple thermal cameras, which exist, and you could point them at the different structures. And now on a dashboard in front of the chief, he's also looking at the exposure temperatures on all sides of this building. Let's say there's buildings that surround the building that's on fire, or if we're thinking of an apartment complex, there's other buildings, right, that have other apartments on it. Well, exposures are always a big deal. Because there's always a chance of them also catching on fire. And so you have to be careful. Probability of extraction. Oh, well, this is starting to get into sort of the fun stuff. What if the chief was looking at data on their dashboard and it was giving them probability statistics on the type of structure it was and how hard maybe extraction would be if we thought there was somebody in there? Obviously, life comes before property at all times. So if, as a firefighter, if we truly believe there was a possibility of somebody being inside, well, we were going to basically do everything we could to go find them. And sometimes you would find out that they actually weren't in the building at all, that they were in the parking lot, just nobody knew where they were, right? Okay, we can go even deeper than that. Maybe I'm getting real-time data on the average firefighter oxygen depletion. Ooh, that would be cool. That kind of exists, really. Not in my time when I was a firefighter, but I think it's out there now. A lot of times this stuff starts in the military and sort of trickles down to the different fire departments domestically. So that would be great to have. what if I got information on alarm history by date and location? In the area of town where I used to be a firefighter in Atlanta, we would go pretty much to the same, if it was the same apartment complex, we had like 53 apartment complexes in the same area that I worked from my station. And so it was common to get fires in the same types of apartment complexes. Now, that kind of stuff we knew when we arrived, but what if there was data to show me exactly what happened last time and how fast the fire was spreading and exposures and everything else? Real-time hydrant flow. That's really important because sometimes you can have some really weak hydrants. Water flows downhill, so if you have a hydrant that's at the end of the line and it's beyond another hydrant and you're trying to pull water from it, a lot of times you can end up robbing water from yourself while you're trying to fight a fire. That's a really big deal, and if a chief was also getting real-time information on that, be super helpful. And finally, maybe some past burn rates of similar exposures, kind of like what I was talking about with the alarm history. Now I'm going to take all of this data. Let's just assume now this is all on the dashboard in front of me. And now I add in my gut feel. I've got 20 years experience as a chief. What do I think is going on? And now when I put that all together, I take all that data and the dashboard spits out and says, this is what you should do. That is prescriptive analytics. When you have all that data coming in and you trust it, and you're able to make very, very good decisions by marrying in what your intuition is saying with all that experience that we can't ignore. That's where prescriptive analytics comes in. That is the future of really most businesses, hopefully. And we're already starting to see this. Prescriptive would be like mortgage companies using this for should I give a loan or not, right? Very yes or no, green or red type dashboard type settings is where you might see this. Credit reports as well would be another great example of that. Okay, so this is really important because right now this matters because by 2020 it's predicted that 50% of organizations will lack sufficient AI and data literacy skills to achieve business value. That's 2020. It is currently the middle of 2019. We're not that far away. So this is a really big deal, and this is actually brought up by Valerie Logan, who works for Gartner. It's I don't know, scary. It depends on how you want to look at it. Depends on where your organization is right now. So who is data literate? Well, 24% of business decision makers, 32% of C-level executives, and the scariest one, only 21% of our future business owners, right? Our, lawmakers, 16 to 24-year-olds, only 21% of them are currently data literate. This is based on a survey that Click had commissioned. If you want to know, you can see it down there at the bottom. We're in a state of illiteracy. So, why? What happened? Well, we messed up. And who's we? Well, I'm going to go and throw my name in there and say the BI industry messed up. Because what we didn't do to start with is we didn't bring in the concept that intuition, that gut feel was important. And now everyone now realizes that human element is really a big deal. We need to empower the workforce. So data production, how quickly it went from like a floppy drive to a thumb drive, right? The velocity of it. Things like democratization of data. It's really the answer and solution to really all industries, democratizing the data, meaning, as Jordan Morrow would say, you need to get it to everybody. Everybody has to have access to it. Digital transformation, using an example of maybe UPS, who had Internet of Things devices, IoT devices, saving them 144 million gallons of gasoline, right? Digitally transforming the supply chain. But all that data, without bringing in the human element to it, has led to a data literacy skills gap. And this is what we're trying to correct now. This is what the purpose of this webinar is, and so many more programs that I hope to bring to companies to help them close this gap. That's really, really the goal here, is to help companies become data literate, to create data literate cultures. All right. So let's define data literacy. What is it? Well, it's the ability to read, work with, analyze, and argue with data. But as you can see there, I sort of broke out the words and color-coded them. So what I really want to do is sort of back up here. The ability to read, well, what does it mean to read anything? It's the comprehender, right? Reading empowers people. So that's super important. work with. Depends on your role. An architect and a scientist are going to have different roles. There's no one size fits all, but it's the marrying of tech with human elements. Analyze. You got to know what questions to ask. It gets to the why, not tying it back to the business objective. Um, Good example again with fire trucks. Why are we analyzing the data? Well, in my real world experience, we had fire trucks that were starting to add GPS. Obviously, GPS can be really important on fire trucks because it helps the dispatchers know where people are in real time and then deploy them accordingly. That didn't really exist when I was there, and because the culture was such in the department I work for near Atlanta that people distrusted the powers that be. So when they said they were putting GPS on it, it was more like, well, it's Big Brother spying on us, right? And so if you don't have that right culture there to analyze and interrogate the data, it can go awry. And you got to be able to argue with it. You got to interrogate it. Like I said, you have to be a data skeptic. There's a good example in Carl Sagan's book from 1995, The Demon Haunted World. He talks about skeptical thinking, and in it he starts talking about a scenario where he invites people over and says he has a dragon in his garage. And I'm paraphrasing here. But he says he has a dragon in his garage, and the person says, I can't see the dragon. He says, oh, I forgot to mention that this dragon is invisible. And the person says, well, why don't we throw some powder down or some flour down on the floor? We'll see some footsteps. He said, oh, it also hovers. It flies. That won't work either. And this goes on and on and on. Every time somebody brings up a valid point, Carl Sagan says in this scenario that the dragon is, heatless fire and so on and so forth. And I just want to say what he concludes with, which is, now what's the difference between an invisible, incorporeal, floating dragon who spits heatless fire and no dragon at all? If there's no way to disprove my contention, no conceivable experiment that would count against it, what does it mean to say that my dragon exists? Your inability to invalidate my hypothesis is not at all the same thing as proving it true. I think that's an awesome quote, and it really goes to the idea and speaks the idea of skeptical thinking, right? Arguing with the data hypothesis and ultimately saying, even if you can't invalidate the hypothesis with all your questions, is not the same thing as proving it true or false. So it's just a good way to look at it. Now, the Data Literacy Index was commissioned. It was a survey of such that was commissioned by Click. It was done by an independent third party, and essentially what they sought out to do is look at over 600 businesses and large public firms worldwide, and ultimately figure out what's the impact of having a data literate culture or not. And 3 to 5% of greater enterprise value for data literate organizations. So what does that mean? Well, that equates to somewhere between 300 and 500 million in enterprise value for large companies based on market cap. That's considerable, right? So again, this was 600 plus large public firms that were basically surveyed with a lot of different questions. And this is what they found the value to be for those companies who are data literate or, stressed to have a data literate culture. Okay, so before we go on, just a little mental break here because there's a lot going on. This is a great graph among many that come from Tyler Vergen. You can see it down at the bottom right. And this is about correlation and causation. It's just a fun website. You can go to it and kind of look at the different ones. This is one of my favorites. Divorce rate in Maine correlates per capita on like 99% correlation per capita consumption of margarine. So clearly, if we were just to look at this and not argue with it, we would think for sure that, clearly it's a good thing that margarine is not being consumed because it's actually lowering the divorce rate in Maine. That's great. Let's everybody eat butter. That would be much better and less people will be divorced, right? Just a fun example of, making sure that when you're looking at data that you are questioning it at all time. Again, as Jordan would say, be a data skeptic. Okay, so let's move on and start talking about the culture. It's a team effort. And what we're going to talk about here is first we're going to define it. Then we're going to talk about leadership's roles and then get into some of the characteristics of a data literate culture. So let's start with trying to define it. So what does a culture mean? Well, let's sort of define cultivate. That's to foster the growth of or to improve by labor, care, or study. So we can actually sort of add this to our definition of data literacy. And we can come up with something that sort of works, like foster a culture where we can read, work with, analyze, and argue with our data without consequences. I think that's a great start. And really, what I want to emphasize here is the word care, because a data literacy culture must be cared for. Jordan was really great about saying, that within the different data personalities, subcultures, really the message of data literacy must be approached and taught so that all those parts of organization understand the why of data literacy. Um, Data literacy and the data revolution represent a new frame of mind. When you take care of it, it can thrive, and when you push it aside, companies can lose focus on data and thereby fall behind competitors. So it's caring, it's cultivating, and it's fostering that culture where we can do the things that need to be done for data literacy. What you really have to do is you have to acquire it, you have to develop it, and you have to improve it. And then that really sort of circles back and you go back to further acquiring it. And sometimes it means in other departments because, listen, a data literate culture isn't going to necessarily start company wide, right? More than likely, it's going to start with just a little seed, 3 or 4 people in one department, or 3 or 4 people over 3 or 4 departments, right? With one person in each, and you're going to develop it over time, and you're going to improve that culture over time. You're going to figure out what works. Then you're going to go and acquire more people, more champions that can work on it, and you're going to go through the process again. So, what is the role of leadership in all of this to build a data literate culture? Well, first of all, there's got to be vision, right? You have to have data governance, which is basically when two metrics from two different teams don't match up. You need a governed democratization. That would be, we've probably all worked with companies who've seen this. The finance department produces one set of results, and another department produces another set of results, and they're supposed to be on the same metrics, and they don't match up. Also, part of the problem with that is that you have two different departments making the same report, right? That's also part of it. Obviously, data literacy is a huge part of the role of leadership. You have to be able to invest in it, and obviously, you have to keep fostering that culture. So here are some of the characteristics. Everything from data fluency. Obviously, we need data visualizations, analytical skills, as well as statistical methodologies. We need more learning and obviously mentoring. So let's kind of look at some of these. Well, data fluency. That's one way to look at it. That's basically just taking the words in the vocabulary. A lot of companies don't have a common data dictionary. In fact, we have folks that work at SME that focus on data governance, and that's really one of the places we started. Is, hey, do you have a data dictionary? Does everybody speak with using the same words? Oh, that's huge, right? So obviously, what also goes into data literacy are the use of and knowing what a histogram is, or maybe the differences between mean, median, and mode, which all start with M and all get confused all the time. I still get confused. I have to think about them, right? But just knowing those kind of terms, what a control limit might be, those kind of things. Obviously, data visualizations are very, very important. You have to be able to, simplify the data. You need to build reports. You need to gain data and insights, look at trends, and obviously look for patterns along the data. Learning is obviously going to be big. A lot of times we find, data champions within the work culture that we can work with. Um, they hold informal sessions. They make sure the data is included, part of the decision making at all times. They deploy resources, free resources like the data literacy project.org. They work with us. Okay. But learning also doesn't mean just having champions. It also means learning being part of the culture where it's okay to fail and learning from failure. And Goodhart's law is a great example. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So it's a great example right there. Statistical methodologies. Statistical skills equal analytical skills? No, they don't, right? So what does that mean? Well, it means we have to have people who are well versed in predictive algorithms and machine learning, data mining, and hypothesis testing. That's not the same thing as having people who are critical thinking. Not to say they can't be the same people, but a lot of times you need to have all of this. Data analysis, right? That's an analytical skill. Communication is huge. That data storytelling. Can I take what the statistical models are showing me and what's coming out of the machine learning, and can I communicate it to the correct people to actually drive data decisions? And obviously problem solving is a huge part of that as well. And mentoring. Just the idea, if you have a skill in some aspect of data, that you mentor them. Work through your chain, however it might look, whether it's a tree chart like this, or however the it works within your organization, which is an important part to mention, that it's not going to be the same in every organization, nor is that the point. It's never my goal when I walk into a new company or new client that we're working with data literacy, for me to impart on them exactly how we did it the last. You can mentor, right? You can talk about what has worked and what hasn't worked in the past, but ultimately, that organization is unique, and so you need to respect that and come in and figure out what's going to work for them. And a lot of times that's internal mentoring. A lot of times that could be mentoring from a role like myself, where I'm working for a company like SME, and I'm coming in to help them create this data literate culture, but obviously one that's going to work for them. Just like a diet, there's 1,000 of them. Not all diets work for everybody. Everybody eventually needs their own customized diet in order for it to be successful, because it's not a one size fits all type solution. All right, so now that we talked a little bit about culture, let's look at some of the implementation. How to start implementing a data literate culture? Well, you can kind of see it here. It's an ongoing process. And so at the beginning, we're really just looking at that original culture. Again, what I was just talking about. What's currently in place? What's happening? I will tell you that if you have some high level executives that have bought into this, oh, it gets a whole lot easier to work with. If you don't have the executives that have bought into building a data literate culture, obviously you're going to run into a lot of problems. I was just at a event yesterday, as a matter of fact, and I was talking to several different people, and they were telling me stories at their particular companies, where you sort of have the old regime, would be one way of saying it, right? The people that have been around 20 years, and they like to do things like the way they like to do things, and they like to print the reports out, and that's just the way it is. And so going to people like that and saying, I'm not trying to take your job away or make your job change the way you've been doing things fairly successfully. I'm trying to give you new tools that will make you even more efficient. And hopefully, if we've done our job, if I've done my job and we've come in there, we're also going to make them a whole lot more valuable to the company, because it frees them up from maybe running reports that have been taking 3, 6, 9, 2 days, 9 hours to 2 days, and now they're happening in 3, 6, 9 minutes. Well, that leaves you a whole lot more time to do a lot more creative things for your company. So, from the original culture, the communication, obviously the learning, data DNA, and then getting towards that culture of data literacy. But it is an ongoing process along the way. And there's really an adoption framework that kind of works along with it. So let's sort of work through this adoption framework. We got planning and vision. We need to have a discussion with those involved in data and analytics to start with. Communication is obviously huge. That's, two parts to that. Communicating about why data literacy is important. And then second part is, how to communicate. This goes to the people who are going to participate in, like, maybe the first phase as we roll this out, because again, this is going to roll out usually small, in a small group, and then we're going to build over time. This is not a overnight fix, because you can't make meaningful changes in culture. You're just going to get a lot of pushback, a ton of pushback, and it's going to fail. That sort of, like I said, goes back to those original stats about the adoption rate. Even when people have these BI tools, is fairly low a lot of times, and the people who love them are saying, look at this, isn't this great? But a lot of times what can happen is, it can feel like too much too fast, and so it just takes time. It just takes time to work and continue to communicate, to make those changes. You got workforce assessment. I mean, you have to figure out who knows what to start with, right? There's some great tools that you guys can talk to me about, and reach out to me after this webinar, and I'll be happy to point you in the right direction for those, because there's definitely some free tools out there that you can use right now that'll help you with workforce assessment. Obviously, culture learning, prescriptive learning. There's, in fact, more tools. This is kind of goes into what I'll be doing with a lot of clients, which is sort of running, for lack of a better term, 8-week programs, if you will, where we start with 8-week programs, and then we turn around and do it again with maybe a little larger group. So we start with those 5 to 10 original champions. Sometimes it's going to be the people who, at first maybe don't seem like the great examples, but I will tell you, from my own experience, I was always the guy that could sit in a break room, a coffee room, and tell a good story. I could tell a good story when I was a firefighter. It's just sort of built into me. I love doing it. And so sometimes it's finding people who tell good stories. They don't necessarily have to know or understand data right now, But if they're great communicators, those are the people to sometimes to start with, because they're the ones that are going to be able to communicate it and show other people the value in it. So it's going to start with small groups, and maybe we'll go for 8 to 10 weeks, and then we're going to find out the success and failures of that 10 weeks, and we're going to turn around and do it again to maybe 20 or 30 people, or 50 to 100 people, depending on the organization and who the evangelists are. The two things that are really important here are to be curious about data and to be creative. If you have that, we can go from there. We can build. And of course, you have to measure your success along the way. And then when you do, you just start all over with planning and vision and then communication and go around the horn. So that's sort of part of the adoption framework. Now, the role of the chief data officer. Not every company is going to have a CDO, but I wanted to bring it up just so that everybody knew what that was. A chief data officer is a corporate officer responsible for the enterprise-wide governance and utilization of information as an asset via data processing, analysis, data mining, information trading, and other means. So really, the CDO is really important. And even if somebody in your organization doesn't have this title, there's a good chance that they sort of are the de facto CDO. They just may not be called that, or perhaps they're the VP of finance, but they're also sort of the CDO. And this is going to be the person that's sort of working to get the information down through the ranks. So, maybe to the one or two people that work below them. And then, that CDO, she might, take that information to spell it out, and it goes on and on down the chain from there. All right. We are almost at the end, guys, here, but we have one really important section to cover, and that is the actual decision-making progress. So far we've talked about, what is data literacy? We talked about all the good reasons why it's important. Why are we talking about it now? Why is it such a big deal? We've talked about the culture. What does a data literate culture look like? We talked about the implementation of it, but now here's really the meat and potatoes, right? How do we actually go through the decision-making process? So that is what's coming up now. So let's go ahead and start there. There's really 6 sections to this. And it really starts with asking. So this is part of the data-informed decision-making process, excuse me. So ask. You got to formulate a focused question. We need to be able to teach people in our organizations how to formulate a focused question. We're going to talk more in depth about a lot of this. We need to acquire it, search for the best data available, intelligent data. Multiple parties can be brought to the table for this, so communication needs to be similar. We need to be able to analyze it, critically appraise and analyze the data. We need to apply it, removing the personal bias, integrated the data with your professional experience, and be conscious about your mental model. So we're going to get into a little bit about, cognitive bias and what that means. You need to announce it. How are you going to communicate this, right? And then, of course, you need to assess it. You need to monitor the outcome like we were talking about before. And this is, again, going around. You can watch the arrows there. When we're done with assessing it, we're going to formulate new questions. Sometimes this can happen very fast. Sometimes this can happen over several months, depending on the complexity of the problem that we're trying to solve with our data. So ultimately, you have to look at this as maybe, and this is maybe not the best visualization, but think of it more as a spectrum from AI to gut feeling. And what we need to help organizations understand is that you need to be along this spectrum where culture helps drive decisions. So you can kind of see here, almost like a Venn diagram, I put culture, that is that sweet spot in the middle, right? Where we're talking about not only are we giving value to expertise and what that means, because again, as we said, we messed up in the BI industry. We forgot to bring in all that great intuition, those years of experience. And we said, oh, we have all this great data. We got excited, right? Well, now we're sort of correcting that course a little bit. So bringing in the data analysis and even bringing in things like, new things like machine learning, which again, only really works if you have a really, really solid foundation before you, right? You have to have the descriptive and diagnostic analytics below it for machine learning to work with prescriptive analytics and so forth, right? Those higher end models. So it sort of starts off with asking. All right, so what does that mean? Well, you have to start with a goal in mind. The first step is start with a goal in mind. So let's look at an example here from a wine manufacturer. Here are some good examples of starting with a good question, right? Asking the right question. Can profits be increased by securing forward contracts from a region with less expensive grapes? So we can look at questions like this. Another one, what expense categories account for the greatest budget variance by region? Is there seasonality in the variance? That's a very specific question. Another one, are there any patterns or trends that I need to focus on? And along the way, with any good question, you can always give it, try it through 4 different lenses. You can ask 4 questions. Is it specific? Yeah, I would say these are all specific. Do they have a very defined scope? They do. Are they data oriented? Meaning, do they point clearly to what the data will require to answer the question? So, do I know where to look to find the answer? Right. So, with what expense categories, very specifically on that second one, so I know where to go look for the answer. And most importantly, is it answerable? Can I even get an answer to this question? Um, an example of a question that wouldn't be answerable is, why are we losing companies left and right, or customers, not companies? Why are we losing customers left or right? So that's a good question. What happens when a question is vague? How many have seen a question either like this or exactly like this? How is our Q3 marketing campaign? Great, right? Immediately, you have people in the organization who are starting to come up with these next questions because of that poor question. Compared to what, Chief? Quarter 1 or Q2 or Q3 compared to the previous years? What am I supposed to do with this? What is it that you're asking me? Should we examine the ROI of the campaign? Should we analyze the response of various factors within the campaign, such as response rates for different channels or approaches? You can see this, right? You've heard executives say stuff, and I shouldn't pick on executives alone, but somebody along your chain of command has said, "How are things going?" And you think, "Great. Is there something more specific to that?" Because I can actually look in and find those answers if it's specific, if it's got a good scope, if it's data oriented, if it's actually an answerable question. These questions that you ask have to be clearly stated with a little ambiguity as possible. State any assumptions explicitly. It's got to be specific. You may not be able to translate it into one question. It may end up being a series of questions, but by being specific, you can drill those down into those, like part A, part B, part C, part D of a bigger question. But by making them specific, again, we're enabling people to go in and find the exact data to answer that exact question. Obviously, again, it has to be scoped, data oriented, as we said, and it definitely has to be answerable. So just like we were saying before. All right, step number 2, you have to acquire that data. This is called DIKW, for Data Informed Knowledge Wisdom Pyramid, DIKW pyramid. And so really, at the end of the day, it's pretty easy. We need to take the raw data. We need to apply meaning to it. We need to derive knowledge from it and obtain a new wisdom. Okay, so when we're acquiring data, this is sort of the process we're going through. Step 3, we need to analyze it. And it's time to remove personal bias from our analysis. We all need to be data skeptics, and I've brought that up a couple times. It's something I've always heard Jordan Morrow mention, is we all need to be data skeptics. If all of us were more like that, we would actually have better business decisions and actually be positively affecting ROI. I have no doubt about that. So another person that came up with sort of 6 questions was a guy named Thomas Davenport, who has been in the industry for years and years and years. He's written over 20 books within analytics. He holds different positions at astute what I'm trying to say, universities and such. And so these are 6 questions that he sort of came up with in a blog post he wrote, or an article he wrote several years ago, that he felt like, hey, if you don't know where to start, here's 6 questions that have always, served me well. So let's just kind of look at those real quick. What's the source of your data? I think that's one everybody should start with. Ask lots of questions about the data. So if you have somebody that's doing the analysis and, they give you a result, here's a great question to start with. Where did you get this from? If you're reviewing a sampling of your data, how well does the sample data represent the population? I think that's really important as well. Just making sure that sample possibly wasn't too small or not representative at all. Does your data distribution include outliers? How do they affect the results? Just dealing with this not too long ago, a couple days ago, where I was looking at a data set that had several outliers, and it definitely was affecting the results. It was pulling, in this case, it was health related, so it was pulling the weight of these particular clients, customers of this program. Those outliers were greatly affecting averages as well as the results in general. So it was something that had to be dealt with. What assumptions are behind your analysis? Might certain conditions render your assumptions and your model invalid? Great questions. Why did you decide on that particular analytical approach? What alternatives did you consider? We'll actually touch on this in a minute when we talk about bias and one of the particular types of bias that we deal with. And how likely is that the independent variables are actually causing the changes in the dependent variable? Might other analysis establish causality more clearly? If you had somebody who just put a whole report together and their CXO in whatever position it was were asking questions like this in the boardroom, not only would it keep somebody on their toes, but it's not such a bad thing, right? It's just questioning, it's being a skeptic and saying, I see your results, but it's my job to be a data skeptic. It's all of our jobs to be a data skeptic and say, well, okay, that's fine. I see those results, but how did you get them? Are there reasons that you came up with these particular results? Was there bias involved? So many other questions that go along it. If you really want to get to the root cause, you've probably heard this before. You need to ask why 5 times. So let's kind of go through an example of that. Original question: what's the problem? And the first answer that comes back is projects are taking too long to complete. And so, of course, there's the first why. Why? Why are projects taking too long to complete? Because the work is not done to meet deadlines as originally planned. Why is that happening? Well, because the assignments are not being made early enough to individual team members. Therefore, they don't have time to get them done by the original deadline. Well, why would that be happening? Well, because the decisions made on the details of the assignment are taking longer than anticipated. Well, that's definitely a problem, right? But why is that happening? We're getting there. Okay, because project leaders are not reaching an agreement on what needs to be done in a timely manner. Well, why aren't project leaders reaching an agreement? Well, because they're not good at meeting regularly or communicating well due to other obligations. And so what we've really done is we've gone with the original question, which is what is the problem? And we found a solution, a real solution, which is the root cause, because the project leaders are not meeting regularly enough and they have other obligations that are possibly pulling them away from this particular project. There you go. There's where we need to dig in and find a solution. Number 4, apply. Now that you're armed with data-driven analysis, you need to integrate it with your personal experience. And this is a big part of it. And so it's great to have experience, but we don't want it to outweigh data, right? What we really want is a balanced approach to both of them. So along with this comes a couple different examples of cognitive bias. You have confirmation bias, survivor bias, and first conclusion bias. So let's just talk about this real quick. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out information that supports your belief or hypothesis and ignore any information that contradicts it, right? So if I was to give you a firefighter example of that, in my experience, my station was in a poor neighborhood, and might have a confirmation bias that kind of says that, well, fires happen more in poor neighborhoods. Well, that's not really true. What I was doing in that is I was trying to seek out, maybe that's what my bias is, or maybe perhaps I have a negative feeling about poor neighborhoods or whatever the case may be. And instead of looking at it and saying, well, it's shoddy construction, right? That's causing these fires and different things like that. I'm looking at it from a confirmation bias and saying, no, it's because of the poor neighborhoods. Survivor bias is really, it's when you make a decision using only part of the data based off past successes, but ignoring past failures. So again, in fire, I could say, well, the last time we breached that wall, meaning the last time we went through that wall, the victim was right on the other side of it. So that's what we should do this time. Instead of thinking, yes, but the other 5 times we tried that and we breached through that wall, it was a horrible idea because we actually spread the fire into the other 2 units because we didn't use proper firefighting techniques along the way. So using that survivor bias of saying, hey, this worked last time, and ignoring the fact that it didn't work many, many times before that. And then finally, first conclusion bias. And again, these are all sort of fire examples, right? So humans typically tend to make decisions and solve problems by using the first solution that comes to mind. So again, with a fire-related problem, you might have a chief that's like, how are we gonna get on that roof, right? Because of exposures, or maybe because of blocked vehicles or whatever, or maybe the ladder truck is down that day. I mean, there's so many reasons why it might be tough to get on a roof. And the chief says, "Oh, I know what we'll do. We'll put four ladders, extension ladders on the north wall, and we'll approach the roof from that side." And then immediately there's two or three other solutions that make much more sense or maybe safer for the firefighters or whatever. But it's not the first conclusion that the chief came up with, and perhaps he's going to go that route, despite the fact that there might be other solutions that are actually better. And they have actually call this, like, you can use the ladder of inference for this. So here's an example, again, firefighter related, showing that 35% of all cooking or all fires are cooking related or started by cooking. So if you just look at the ladder, I won't go through all of this, but what's really happening, and then I'm looking at the facts, and then I'm trying to apply meaning to it. So how we interpret what we choose to notice, and right away I'm like, that's not what it was. It was, much more electrical malfunctions where I worked. So I don't know why this is saying cooking, right? I'm starting to put my own assumptions on it. And then I'm making conclusions based on assumptions, which may be that this data is wrong. I don't believe it. So whatever my belief is, right? And then actions based on the beliefs. So just being careful as you work through this, ladder of inference, making sure that those biases aren't affecting what you're actually seeing with it. And not to mention, if you look at the very bottom of that bar chart, 21% of that are unknown causes. So that could significantly skew the results there, because although 35% is cooking, if we don't know what 20% of it, that could take something else like other equipment or appliances, and actually, if they all went into that bucket, significantly change the results. So, again, it's all about how we apply. And then we need to announce it, right? We need to decide how we're going to communicate what we found. So I've already talked to you about storytelling. I tell you, it's my favorite part of this. And here's a great quote that I found. Good stories surprise us. They make us think and feel. They stick in our minds and help us remember ideas and concepts in a way that a PowerPoint crammed with bar graphs never can. And this is from two gentlemen with the storytelling edge. I just loved it because it sort of took a shot at PowerPoints and death by PowerPoint, or PowerPoint hell, however you want to say it. I definitely don't love going through those presentations either. And so obviously that's why I've tried to take a little bit more animated approach with this webinar, and hopefully that's working for you. And take time to tell you stories along the way that I hope help drive home the concepts of this particular webinar. And so here's a sort of pyramid principle of a way to look at that. You get your main takeaway, and then you're going to back that up by 3 arguments. And below those arguments, you're going to have 3 more, supporting facts to go with those arguments, and you can sort of see that, so on and so forth. And then finally, we need to assess. We need to monitor the outcome of what we're doing. So really what this means is you got to fail fast, you got to fix it fast, and you got to learn fast. And, if you do that over and over again, chances are you're going to be really, really, really successful. You got to make sure that you're not, suffering from, paralysis by analysis, right? Which is a famous saying. There's another Nelson Mandela quote that talks about learning and not failing. I am a huge, huge personal fan of failing forward, and it's one of the drivers of SME, which is why I love working for SME, because we think a lot alike. And that's that you have to fail. You have to. Just fail fast. Fail forward, as we say, or our CEO, Chris Moyer, says a lot of times. Fail forward. There's nothing wrong with failure. It's just another chance for you to learn. So it's going to happen a lot, especially as we go to create these data literate cultures. There's going to be things that don't work. We're going to find out. We're going to learn from them. We're going to assess. We're going to monitor. And then we're going to fix it. And we're going to start all over and move along. And again, this goes from asking to acquiring and analyzing, applying, announce it, right? That's the communication part of it, assessing it. And then it starts all back over at ask. So there you go. There's your data-informed decision-making process. This is what we would use if we came into your particular organization to start help building that data literate culture. And again, it's not about telling. It's not about, saying this is the way it works. Again, it's coming in with that approach of what's currently going on. Let's find our champions. Let's find the people who are excited about this. I hope it's the CDO. I hope it's the executives, but it's not going to always be that way. They're not going to be the ones that are driving this. Sometimes it's going to be, middle level, somebody who's maybe in BI. and works with charts and graphs and really sees the value in data literacy. And we're going to start there, and we're going to build from there and help them in any way we can, because their needs are going to be a little bit different than if we're starting from the top and sort of insisting that this culture is adopted company wide, which is a little bit different, right? If it's mandated, you still got to be careful with that because you're going to get pushback. All right, guys. Well, we've really covered a lot here. So let's just talk real briefly about next steps. And that really comes down to connecting with me, connecting with SME. Um, if you're in the Tampa area, coming by and saying hi, or following me on LinkedIn. So there's a lot of different ways you can connect. Like I said, LinkedIn, just that / it's, I think it's LinkedIn, then it's like that /IN, then Brian Masseri, and you'll find me right there. Um, Say hi. Let me know what you thought about this webinar. You could always email us at info@smesgroup.com, and it will get to me. Like I said, we're headquartered in Tampa, Florida. Now, we actually have people that work from SME that are throughout the United States working on different projects, but we are headquartered, and the majority of us are right here in Tampa. So if you're in this area, by all means, let's get together. Let's talk about this. And then you can find us on the web at smesgroup.com. That's it. We did it. You guys, I really appreciate you hanging out with me for this very lengthy but hopefully informative webinar all about data literacy. I hope it gets you thinking and it gets you excited. If I did my job today, you're coming away with a couple key nuggets and you're thinking, hopefully, this is something I can do, or I can be part of, or I can use and bring it to, maybe the upper levels of my company if it's not you, right? This is important. Everybody else is going to be working on this too. Those companies that get on this faster are going to have a higher return on ROI. There's just simply, I don't believe it to be any other way. This is a game changer. So with that, I'll leave you. Thanks a lot for hanging out with me today, and hopefully I will get to talk to you or meet you soon.